earlier, Anna and I, as well as and Abby being part of this church, also we used to be part of this church. Won't give you a complete record of our potted history of our life, but 20 years ago, Anna and I moved to Brussels, and moved to Bicester, and we were super young, I was like 21 or something, and we were part of this church for 2 years, which was fantastic. And we had our first 2 years of married life here, and we had our first baby here, and we had a great time, really fond memories of our time here. And then we sensed God speaking to us about moving on, and so we moved to Brussels, and we spent 15 years living in Brussels, overseeing a church there, and we saw God do really precious things during that time, actually. God really established a significant church in that city that is flourishing and thriving, and then we felt God speak to us to say to leave that behind, to leave the land of waffles and beer and chocolate, and hand on the church, which we did, and we moved back to the UK about 18 months ago. I think the last time I preached at this church, it would have been about 18 years ago, so I don't know if the next invitation will come in 18 years' time. I don't know, who knows? As Mark said as well, Anna and I helping to lead the family of churches that we are a part of. We say to people, if you're a Christian, like the Bible says, you need to be part of a church. That's how you grow. That's how you get discipled. That's how you develop in your faith. It's good for you. You can serve and you can be blessed. Don't try and be a Christian all by yourself in a corner somewhere. It's the same principle for a local church. Local churches can be independent, all hidden away somewhere. You can do that, but it's much healthier, much better for everyone if you're part of a wider family, a wider network. And ours happens to be called Salt and Light Advance, and actually we're much better together. So a group of 17, 18 or so churches where we can be a part of something wider, something bigger, something that lifts our spirits, lifts our vision a little bit higher. The Gospel of Mark, that's what we're in. So if you have a Bible, please find it. I should have said that we live in Whitney now. We have 4 children. We said to, and 3 of them are boys, and we gave them all the choice of coming to Bicester today. They all said no. I just don't know how that's possible. They all said no. But our little girl, she came with us, and she's out there. The Gospel of Mark. You've been looking at this fantastic gospel over the last few weeks. I love the Gospel of Mark. I must say it's probably my favourite of the 4 Gospels. I imagine you've seen over the last few weeks that it is a gospel that moves fast. It's like not a gospel for pausing and carefully reflecting. Mark, he's not that type of character. It goes fast. Chapter 1, there's no shepherds, there's no wise men, there's no picturesque scenes with Mary going across nothing like that. We're just straight in as John the Baptist as an adult, Jesus as an adult, choosing 12 disciples. Come on, guys, let's go. And that's the tone for the rest of the Gospel of Mark. It's bang, 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 action all the way. It's kind of like watching an action film. It's that type of feeling when you read the book of Mark. And I think last week you looked at chapter 4 and chapter 5. I was nodding, yes. And today we've been asked to cover a little bit of chapter 6 and chapter 7. If you look at the beginning of chapter 6, you'll see Jesus. We read that Jesus goes to Nazareth, his hometown, where he is not popular, and he has to leave. He is not accepted. So verse 6 or so, verse 6 and 7, he leaves Nazareth, he goes to other villages around, and he sends his 12 on mission. Like the first group mission trip. He sends these 12 on mission to continue all the activity that he's been doing. We read that in those verses. And verse 14 onwards, we read a pretty harrowing story of the death of John the Baptist. Mark chapter 6, verse 14 onwards. That's Jesus' cousin. So that's a tough one. It's a pretty brutal murder as well. Chapter 6, verse 30 is what we're going to look at in a moment. Famous story of Jesus of Jesus feeding the 5,000. We're going to come back and look at that story in a moment. Verse 45 of chapter 6, Jesus moves on and he goes to the Sea of Galilee and the extraordinary story of walking on the Sea of Galilee miraculously. With the disciples. Chapter 7, he moves on and he's confronted by a bunch of religious leaders, some of the Pharisees, that have come up all the way from Jerusalem just to have a go at him and ask him questions and argue with him. And Jesus gives as good as he gets. And then chapter 7, verse 24, and the last bit of chapter 7, Jesus, for one of the few times in his ministry, leaves Israel. He goes outside of Israel. He goes to Syria in the north, and he has an encounter with a lady up there, and more healings whilst he's there. So Jesus is busy. Anyone thinks they've had like a busy week? No. This is like real busyness. He's at the height of his ministry. And he's traveling around, and he's teaching, and he's healing, and he's delivering demons, and he's feeding thousands of people. It's quite an extraordinary moment in his life. And in the context of busyness and activity and crowds everywhere, we read this story, the story of Jesus feeding the 5,000, Jesus providing for a lost and hungry people. Let's read this famous story of Jesus feeding the 5,000. Mark chapter 6, verse 30 onwards. The apostles gathered around Jesus, and they reported to him all they had done and taught whilst they were on the mission trip, just at the beginning of the chapter. Then, because so many people were coming and going, and they didn't even have a chance to eat, he said to them, "Come with me by yourselves to a quiet place, and we'll get some rest." So they went away by themselves in a boat to a solitary place. But many who saw them leaving recognized them and ran on foot from all the towns and got there ahead of them. When Jesus landed and saw a large crowd, he had compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. So he began teaching them many things. By this time it was late in the day, so his disciples came to him. "This is a remote place," they said. "It's already very late. Send the people away so they can go to the surrounding countryside and villages and buy themselves something to eat." But he answered, "You give them something to eat." They said to him, "That would take more than half a year's wages. Are we to go and spend that much on bread and give it to them to eat?" They said to him, but he answered, "How many loaves do you have?" he asked. "Go and see." When they found out, they said, 5. Oh, and 2 fish as well. Then Jesus directed them to have all the people sit down in groups on the green grass. So they sat down in groups of hundreds and 50s. Taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish and looking up to heaven, he gave thanks and he broke the loaves. Then he gave them to the disciples to distribute to the people. He also divided the 2 fish among them all. They all ate and were satisfied. And the disciples picked up 12 basketfuls of broken pieces of bread and fish. The number of men who'd eaten was 5,000. Quite a story, isn't it? Imagine even if you've never been in a church before, you're probably familiar with this story at least. I said we lived in Belgium for all those years. Belgium was famous, as I said, for lots of things. One thing it used to be kind of very well known for was in the sort of Middle Ages, it had several extraordinary artists and painters. People like Rubens and Van Dyck, if that means anything to anyone. Some of the sort of extraordinary Flemish masterpieces that were created in that time. Well, this is a Flemish masterpiece, which probably wasn't designed to be shown on a school wall through technology 400 years later. This is a painting by a chap called Peter Bruegel. He painted this in 1559, and it's called The Fight Between Carnival and Lent. So Carnival, that's like Shrove Tuesday, Mardi Gras, all that type of thing. Big thing in Holland, big thing in Belgium, big thing in Spain. That's Carnival. And then Lent, obviously, is completely different. So this is depicting like those 2 bits of the church calendar. One bit, Carnival, which is all about partying and enjoying the joys of life and eating all the food you want. And then you switch over on Ash Wednesday to Lent, and it becomes more somber and serious. And this is what this painting is about. There are about 200 people in that picture. Some of them, if you look very carefully, you Google it when you get home, doing some intriguing things. There's one thing going on in this picture. There's one main idea, Carnival to Lent, but there's tons of other things going on in the story. I did think about putting a picture of Where's Wally on this. If that speaks to you more, have that in your mind. Like scene and tons of things going on. But there's like one main thing, Carnival to Lent, with hundreds of lots of little things going on. That is what's happening in the text we just read. There's like one main idea. Jesus is feeding 5,000, we get that. But actually there's all sorts of other little things going on in this story which all help point to and feed into the main ideas. And actually a lot of the little things that are going on in this passage take us back to the Old Testament as they help us understand the main thing. So we're going to see some of the little things happening in this story which help us understand the main overarching aim of the painting, the passage as it were. First thing to notice in the passage we just read is the location. Where is this famous story of thousands of people being fed from loaves and fishes happening? If you look at verse 31, we just read, Jesus says to his tired disciples, "Come with me by yourselves to a quiet place and get some rest." Then the next verse, so they went away by themselves in a boat to a solitary place. Quiet place, solitary place. Verse 35 says the disciples say to Jesus, "Hey, this is a remote place." It's a quiet place, it's a solitary place, it's a remote place. I said earlier that Mark it's a fast gospel. It's the shortest of all, only 16 chapters, the shortest of all the gospels. He's got the shortest amount of words. He's a bit stingy with his vocabulary. He's not like John or Matthew who have great, long, detailed bits. He's a bit stingy, Mark. Here we have in the NIV 3 words: quiet, solitary, remote. Actually, that is only one Greek word. Mark just uses the same word 3 times. It's like I think translators can't quite cope with that, so they use 3 synonyms. But actually, it's only one word in Greek that Mark uses 3 times. It's the same word which we see in the first chapter of Mark. The first chapter of Mark, 4 times, Mark says Jesus goes for 40 days with the devil into the desert. 4 times he says desert, 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 desert. 3 times we get the same word in chapter 6, which is a quiet place, a remote place, a solitary place, or a desert. So this famous story happens, first of all, it happens in a desert. We've got people who are physically exhausted. They're tired, they're hungry, they've just been on mission. They come back, they're tired, they've said that. They're emotionally drained. Like John the Baptist has just been horribly killed, like beheaded. That's Jesus' cousin. They would have known him. That's emotionally traumatic. They've just had that news. They're physically tired, emotionally tired. They are crazy busy. Activities going on every day. They are peopled out. They're like, "No more people, please, Jesus." Anyone identify with that sometimes? That's enough. So what does Jesus do? He takes them to a desert. Tired, a little bit traumatized, emotionally drained, peopled out, and Jesus decides, let's go to a desert. What's the definition of a desert? True definition of a desert. Simply somewhere with no rain, no precipitation. You can have a desert in Antarctica. You can have a desert in Africa, Asia. You can have a desert in Israel. This isn't a desert here of sand and cactuses, but it is an empty, desolate, inhospitable place. Disciples are tired, pressured. They've got crowds pushing on to them. And this miracle of providing bread for a tired people happens in the desert. Does that have any alarm bells from the Old Testament going off in our minds? We think of one of the most famous portions of Scripture, the Israelites in Egypt, miraculously out of Egypt through the Red Sea. Moses leads them into a desert where they spend 40 years, and every day God provides miraculously for them, gives them manna miraculously. Tired, lost people in the desert. That's the first thing to have in our mind. We think of this painting of Jesus, this painting of feeding of the 5,000. That's the main idea. There's plenty of things in the background. One of them is, where's this happening? It's happening in a desert. Next thing to see in the picture, the background of our picture, is this description in verse 34. Jesus landed, took off the boat, saw a large crowd. He had compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. They get off their boat, they want to be alone, and there's crowds everywhere. And whilst we might have gone, go away, Jesus responds impeccably, has compassion on them. Because they are, according to Mark, he sees them like sheep without a shepherd. That is a really, really biblical phrase. Moses, in Numbers chapter 27, he's about to die. He's coming to the end of his life. Joshua's going to take over. And Moses says to God, I don't want the Lord's people, your people, Lord, to be like sheep without a shepherd. It's like one of his dying wishes, as it were, with Joshua just there. We fast forward a few years, the times of the kings. We read this in 1 Kings 22. That's a prophet speaking, a guy called Micaiah, who speaks to the king at the time. He doesn't want to have anything to do with Micaiah. And Micaiah says, I saw all Israel scattered on the hills like sheep without a shepherd. So Moses says, I don't want them to be like sheep without shepherds. You fast forward a few hundred years, the prophet says, I can see these people are going to be sheep without a shepherd. And you get right to the end of the Old Testament story, you get to Ezekiel. And Ezekiel chapter 34 is a whole chapter where God says to the leaders of Israel, you have been lousy at looking after Israel. And we get this expression, my sheep, says God, they were scattered over the whole earth. No one searched for them. No one looked for them. That's what you were meant to do, leaders. You didn't do it. My people are now like sheep without a shepherd. And Jesus looks at this people near the Sea of Galilee in this desert area and says, I have compassion on you because you're like sheep without a shepherd. It's an image that speaks of God's kindness. He's a kind God. He's a sacrificial shepherd who lays down his life for his sheep. Remember many years ago I met I thought she was quite old then, but she's still alive, so she probably wasn't actually that old now. She's probably only in her 60s or 70s. She told me a story, this lady, of how a long time ago when she was a younger woman, she and her husband went to be missionaries in South America. And I think it was Chile or Peru, one of those countries, and they were sent out by their mission organization, as happens, and they found themselves in the country, and they were headed to the house where they were going to stay, where they were going to be living for their time in this nation. They got to the house, and they met at the house the couple who they were taking over from, like the previous missionaries up to that point. And they came in the house, and they met their family, and the family said, we'll give you a tour of your house, because this is where you're going to be living. This is the missionary's house. Give you a tour, and then we'll go, and then we'll leave you. It's your house. So they started having a tour of the house. Here's the sitting room area, and here's the kitchen, and they've showed them around the lovely kitchen, and just about to go upstairs, and the lady, the new couple said, what about that cupboard there? What about that door there? Where does that go? Immediately, the existing couple said, that's a cupboard, but we don't go in there. Okay, well, why don't you go in, why don't we open the door? And the couple said, there's rats in that cupboard. There's rats in there, so we don't go in there. We just leave that cupboard. You got the new couple thinking, a bit funny. Okay, rest of the tour of the house, upstairs, here's a bedroom, here's another bedroom, there's a garden. End of their end of their tour, and the existing couple, time to go, time to say goodbye to the home they've lived in, their life as missionaries. They get their suitcases, off they go, and the new couple stand at the front door. Remember this old lady telling me this story. She stood on the threshold of her new house, and she looked out and watched this couple as they drove off, and she watched until she couldn't see the car anymore. What do you think is the first thing this couple did? They've gone, shut the door, head straight to that cupboard. Open the cupboard, and guess what? yeah, there's rats in it. Some of them alive, some of them dead. And it's grim, and it's horrible. And they spend the next how many hours, the first thing they did in their new home, clean out the cupboard, wash it down, get rid of it, scrub it, put down some rat poison, do all they need to do. And eventually, they've got space, got a lovely room, extra room on their kitchen they can enjoy, which before this other couple weren't using. The story just came to my mind earlier today, and I just wonder if there's some of us who, it's like we've got rats in the cupboard. It's like we've got things from our past that we think, I'm leaving that there. I just better to leave the door shut. I'm not even opening that door. It is too smelly, too painful. Let's just ignore that. As Jesus comes and has compassion on these lost people, he wants to help them. He wants them to know the full blessing of following the Good Shepherd. And it's like some of us, we think, I'll just leave that there. Rather than say, no, I want to enjoy the full blessing of knowing God. Of the full blessing of walking with a kind, compassionate shepherd. This happens in a desert, this miracle. Makes us think of God's provision. Jesus says, I'm the shepherd here. That's the second detail in this picture. It goes on though. Why don't we keep going? We get a little bit further down. If we get down, verse 37, 38, Jesus has this discussion with the disciples. And can you give them something to eat? No, we can't give them anything to eat, Jesus. There's 5,000 people. Have you got any bread? Yes, we've got some bread. It kind of goes back and forth. Eventually, Jesus says, just give them what you've got. Verse 39, Jesus directed them to have all the people sit down in groups on the green grass. So Jesus orders them into groups, just because that's practically easier, presumably. And we get this intriguing description from Mark that they sit down on the grass, the green grass. It's a funny detail, isn't it? Mark is very deliberate in the details he adds. As I said, he's a bit stingy. He doesn't have great, elaborate descriptions. You have to get to other books of the Bible for that. But 3 times he's told us this is happening in a desert. And now he says, oh yeah, in this desert, by the way, Jesus finds some green grass. Green grass, what does that symbolize? That symbolizes life and growth and abundance and freshness. For several years, Anna and I, we lived in a house in Brussels. We bought the house, and it was a doer-upper, this house. Anyone had one of those? We did it up. We did it up over several years, more or less. We moved into the house. We had a really nice garden. For a big city like Brussels, we had a good size garden. I'd say probably the length of this room. Not as wide, the length of this room. And we had some grass. In fact, we had a whole section of the garden had some lovely green grass, a nice kind of English-style lawn. We also had 3 boys, and the 2 did not combine well. And the first few months, I was like the mean dad saying, you are not playing football on that green grass. After a few months, a little bit of compassion came out, and we said, yeah, of course, okay, fine. Of course, they ruined the green grass on that garden, absolutely ruined it. So when we left, it was just mud everywhere. A couple of years later, we saw the house again, and the new people had grown fresh grass all along the chunk of the garden. Grass speaks of life and growth and abundance. This miracle happens, yes, in a desert, but Jesus manages to find some green grass. Maybe when we just say that expression, maybe also our Old Testament antenna is doing something there. Up to this point in the Bible, there is only one other place, only one other reference to green grass in the scriptures. Psalm 23. The Lord is my, shepherd. Makes me lie down in green pastures, green grass. Who wrote Psalm 23? Oh, David. Who was David? He was the shepherd king, saying, there's a shepherd of all, you're called the Lord, who makes us lie down in green grass. It's this painting that we're drawing about feeding the 5,000, happening in a desert. That makes us think of the provision of God. We've got this thing about the shepherd, the kindness of this shepherd who looks after us. And actually he helps us find green grass in the desert. It clearly must be in Mark's thinking. Let's look at one last thing. It goes on. They divide everything up. The people eat. Verse 42, we read, they all ate and were satisfied. The disciples picked up 12 basketfuls of broken pieces of bread and fish. They all ate and were satisfied. Like they ate a meal together. This is not just like a biscuit before church. This is like a meal and they are satisfied. I don't know when the last time you had a real satisfying meal was. Like when you were full, like Christmas, I don't know, a few weeks ago. Yeah, or any other celebrations. Well, that seems to be what happened here. They've eaten and they've eaten well. And not only that, did you see like the other miracle here? There's 12 basketfuls left over. There wasn't even 12 basketfuls at the beginning, but there were 12 basketfuls at the end. We have 4 children in a house. That's a miracle. That doesn't happen. More food at the end than at the beginning. They were satisfied. They were fulfilled. They'd eaten enough. That too is like an Old Testament alarm sounding. Here's just a few things. We could look at more, but here's one passage, Deuteronomy chapter 8. In the desert, they write the law, and amongst the law says, when you've eaten and are satisfied, praise the Lord your God. Fast forward a few hundred years, you meet somebody like Ruth. Ruth, wonderful, brave, strong, servant-hearted woman. She is in poverty, though. She comes back to Israel. She comes to Israel. She's not an Israelite. She comes to Israel, and she doesn't have anything, of any food. She has to beg, essentially, for food. And she meets someone who's a bit like Jesus, who ends up being called a kinsman redeemer. And Boaz is his name. And Boaz says, come over here, Ruth. Have some bread. Not any old food. Dip it in the wine vinegar. When she sat down with the harvesters, he offered her some roasted grain. The ultimate romantic dish. She ate all she wanted, and she had some left over. Like with this Christ-like figure in front of her, she eats and she's satisfied, and there's some left over. So this story that we're reading in Mark 6 is in the desert, but at the end people are satisfied. It's in the desert, a solitary, remote, quiet place, but at the end they've eaten enough, and in fact they've got more than they even need. What does Psalm 23 say? It says, my cup overflows, like more than we need. Your goodness, your love will follow me all the days of my life. That's the promise of this good shepherd. This one who leads us sometimes even into deserts, but he leads us to green grass, and he gives us what we need and even more. Not a promise that life will always be straightforward. That's obviously not the Christian promise, obviously. Like, this is a really hard time for the disciples. Hard time. Challenging time. They're super busy. People want to kill Jesus. They haven't got any money, haven't got any homes. This is like a stressful time, we could say. So life's not straightforward, but that's not the promise. The promise, though, is that there's a good shepherd who looks after us and leads us to green grass, even in the desert. And even it gives us more left over than we might have had at the beginning. The fact that there's more left over, that means that there's stuff for other sheep. to put it that way. Like, they can now feed other people with all their basketfuls. I can't believe those basketfuls of broken bread and fish were just chucked away. Surely they shared them further. There's something about the heart of the shepherd, the good shepherd, who wants to draw in other sheep. We read a little bit of Ezekiel 34 earlier. As God criticizes the people, the leaders, just the leaders, and he says, you haven't brought back the strays. You haven't searched for the lost sheep. You meant to do that, but you haven't done it. And as the chapter goes on, God says, well, I'm going to be the shepherd of Israel. You didn't do it properly, I'm going to do it. A prophecy of Jesus coming, really, as the good shepherd. And God says, I myself will search for the lost. I will bring back the strays. And then Jesus comes 500 or 600 years later and says, I'm the good shepherd. I know my sheep know me, but I have other sheep that are not of this sheep pen. I must bring them also. The heart of the good shepherd is always to draw in more sheep. Why do we do alpha courses? Why do we want to reach other people in this town? Why even have a church? Why didn't you just have one church in Bicester? No, we need many churches, because there are tens of thousands of people around here who are like lost sheep and they don't know the good shepherd. When we last lived here, this would have been a field. That's correct, isn't it? Well, now there's about, I don't know how many thousands of people who live here. That's several thousand people who probably don't know the good shepherd. Our motivation for being part of a church family, yes, it's so that we're cared for. Yes, it's so that we're loved and we love others, but it's also so that we can draw others. Why bother with Banbury? Can't we just stay here in Bicester? Much easier, isn't it? Because it's a whole town of, 60, 70,000 people, lots of whom don't know Jesus. So of course we want to have a presence over there. And while we're at it, why not Aylesbury and Milton Keynes and Buckingham and all the other places I imagine Mark's got not up his sleeve, on his heart. Something about catching the heart of the good shepherd. And once we've caught it, we want to reach other sheep. I guess that's what I'm trying to say. So this story, it is like a beautiful painting, but even more beautiful than any of the Flemish masterpieces from history. Jesus feeding the 5,000. That's the main thing. But it's happening in a desert. Let's not miss that. He provides in the desert, just like God provided for the people of Israel. He's a wonderful, kind, compassionate shepherd who cares for lost sheep. And his kindness means that he doesn't want us to leave us where we are. And if, like any of us have got rats in cupboards, we've got a kind God who will help us deal with that. Help us move on. Help us enjoy the fullness of life with God. Green grass, that's in this painting. It's there, drawing, colouring in. That's there, green grass, not any old bit of the desert. A good shepherd who leads us to green grass, and he gives us what we need and more. Not a promise that everything will be perfect, but a promise that he's with us and that his kindness will always help us. Amen. Amen.